It's the story of the book that changed the course of human history. The book, which may or may not be tied all the way back to the ancient Egyptians, but a book nonetheless that changed the direction of science. The occult origins of science is the subject of the Forbidden Universe, and I'll explain how if we didn't have that particular book, we wouldn't have Earth, Wind, and Fire, perhaps, doing Serpentine Fire. We wouldn't have that song if it hadn't been for Hermes and the Hermetica. We'll talk about that, plus just how it is that science started as a search for the mind of God, and how it is that science is still influenced by magic, at least in my opinion. We'll ask Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince about that coming up next. They're our guests. The Forbidden Universe, the true story can now be told, coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. So The Forbidden Universe is the new book out by Lynn and Clive. We've had them on many times. Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince are authors of their own books, and then together they have written books like The Templar Revelation, Secret Guardians of the True Identity of Christ, and Turin's Shroud, one of my favorite books, In Whose Image. Good evening to Lynn and Clive.
Hello. Hello. Actually, Ian, can I just say, sorry to be a troublemaker, but I'm finding it very, very difficult to hear you.
Yes,
you're very faint.
Gone very quiet.
Yes.
Am I faint, or is it just the phone connection's faint?
I think it's you.
Okay, so if I shout louder, then you'll be able to hear me. Okay.
Not sure that would work.
All right, well, I will take for Michelle and for Nathan back in the studio, anything you all can do to juice my voice then so that they can hear me better on the feed. If not, we'll try calling back again at the bottom of the hour and see if we can't get a better connection, okay?
Okay.
Is this a current picture of you two on the cover of The Forbidden Universe?
It's from a little while back, but it's we still look more or less like that.
I don't. Obviously, I don't get older.
Well,
I mean, this is. I've got short hair now. I've got a sort of 1920s style bob.
Well, I would say, because this photo, you all look like you're just about to open for Fleetwood Mac. I'm like, you guys look like you're just about to hit the stage. I love it. And I love the book, too. Very interesting. And we'll get into the meat of that in just a minute. Let's go back, though, first. Did you hear the story earlier in the week about a new Da Vinci artwork that they're investigating right now? Did you hear about that?
Yes, we did. This painting called the Salvator Mundi, Savior of the World, that's been around for a while, but they think they've authenticated it as a genuine Leonardo.
Okay, and the significance of this painting is that at least in the article I was reading, was that this is a self-portrait, or at least that Da Vinci used his own image in the painting of Salvator Mundi, of the Savior of the World. That's him, right?
Well, yes. I mean, that's certainly what they said. It wouldn't be at all surprising because Leonardo, loved putting himself in his works. I must say, if it was him, he doesn't look very well. Because it's not a particularly, cuddly picture of Jesus, is it? I mean, you wouldn't look at him and think, I must go and tell him all my troubles. It's somebody who's very off-putting and looks rather ill. But then Leonardo, whenever he depicted Jesus, he didn't exactly do it in a cuddly fashion. So,
well, I just thought that was informative. If art experts agree that that's Da Vinci using himself as a model for Christ, doesn't that also then speak to other times in which Da Vinci used himself in his own artwork and in the image of Jesus? And I think that goes back to the Turin's Shroud.
Absolutely. The book we wrote, the first book we wrote together, actually argued that Leonardo da Vinci was the person that made the shroud, not only created the shroud, but put his own image on there. And one of the pieces of evidence that we put forward called a lot of evidence for that. But one of the pieces of evidence in the most recent version of the book actually does relate to the Salvator Mundi painting. Because there are a few versions of this painting around, and people have never... The official line is that Leonardo's original that he was known to have painted was lost. But there's lots of copies going around made by his pupils. But now they've identified one of these that's always been thought of as a copy as actually being the original. Now, we actually used one of the other versions in our book, but it's a painting... that side of the original, or was an absolutely precise copy made by one of his best pupils. And we found that when you actually overlay that image of the Salvator Mundi onto the face of the man on the shroud, the two images correspond absolutely precisely. Every feature is the same, and they're also physically the same, exactly the same size. That's something that got us very excited. Now, if they're saying that they found one of those that actually they believe is the original, what the art historians are saying about Leonardo does start to converge with what we've always said about him. Particularly about his work on the shroud. So we're very excited about it.
And of course, the big implication of Leonardo using his own face for the man on the shroud is that indirectly our culture, the Western culture, gets our idea of what Jesus looked like from the shroud. And the idea of, the instantly recognizable Jesus, the one on all the stained glass windows, the plaster statues, you name it, everywhere, is actually basically Leonardo da Vinci.
Yeah.
Which, is, depending on your point of view, can be shocking or very funny. And the idea that, people for all these hundreds of years since Leonardo stroke the shroud, first sort of really surfaced, then, you have people crossing themselves in front of images of, basically a 15th century homosexual heretic.
Well, I mean, by some accounts. I mean,
indeed.
Right.
Indeed. But no, let's just float that as an idea then. Let's say, what if? What if people have been crossing themselves in front of images of Leonardo da Vinci? I mean, it's quite a big joke, depending on how you look at it.
Well, yeah, and it was, I mean, why not, in a way? I mean, since we don't know what Jesus looked like per se, why not Da Vinci substituting his own image? I mean, his own image was just as good as any other image. It wasn't like he was taking away the real image and putting his own in there. Since nobody knew, he was another guy with long hair and a beard. That kind of worked. And so, I mean, it's just as it's just as one was just as good as another. However, I think what was interesting about that right away is it backed up your theory, and one which gets a lot of discussions exactly who created the shroud. That if it were faked, and I think I'm in agreement with you all that it is a forgery. The Shroud of Turin is a forgery, but it's a beautiful, masterful, scientific forgery of something which continues, I think, to inform us to this day of just how accomplished people were. And it wasn't a matter of whether or not it was painted on, that they actually had technology that was greater than that when they created the shroud, and one that continues to confound scientists today.
Well, yes. I mean, our feeling is it shouldn't continue to confound them, because obviously we would say this, wouldn't we? But the truth of the matter is that we were the first people ever to reproduce all the so-called miraculous characteristics of the shroud by using basically a basic photographic technique, which we believed Leonardo himself used to get the image of the shroud, because it's not a painting, And even the people who believed it was genuinely, the image of Jesus, said the image behaves like a photograph. So we took that and we actually, using the very basic technology that we knew he used, not only could have had access to, but did have access to. And basically we came up with an image that had all the characteristics of the Turin shroud on it. So it really shouldn't continue to confound scientists now. We did it.
Well, that's interesting, and I think it's also sort of a perfect transition into the the new book, The Forbidden Universe, Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, and the occult origins of science. Let's talk about this book, the Hermetica, because it's a real book. We know it exists. You can buy an English translation of it on Amazon, but it has come in and out of the scientific world. It's been published, and then it was suppressed for years, and then it came back, and then it was sort of gone again. So talk about this book, the Hermetica, and what does it mean to us today?
Well, the Hermetica is it's a collection of books. So it's a compilation of sort of about 18 different treatises written by members of the same kind of philosophical and religious cult, essentially. And the way we put it in the book is that the Hermetica, which is the collective name for this collection of works, these have been extraordinarily influential over our culture, over Western culture. And the way we put it in the book is that they've had more influence and impact on Western culture than any other collection of books apart from those in the Bible. And they've had more influence and impact over modern Western culture than any other collection of books, including those of the Bible. And yet, I think most people have never really heard of them. And they're extraordinarily influential, mainly because of their inspiration of the Renaissance. It was really these books were lost for a long time. They were certainly around in Egypt during the period when Egypt was under Greek and Roman domination. They were definitely written during that period. How much Egyptian stuff is in there that goes back even further than that is something we can. I think we're talking about later.
But the Hermetica, we could at least trace some of it, at least maybe even the core of it, back to ancient Egypt.
We certainly can. The core ideas in there. For a long time, it was always considered they were written quite late, and they were mainly inspired by Greek ideas. But there's a lot of evidence emerging now that the core ideas in there go back, in fact, right to the beginning of the Egyptian civilization. The same religion that inspired the building of the pyramids.
And who is it that is generally thought of at least being the original, the writer of the core material for the Hermetica?
Nobody knows who wrote them. They're all attributed to a character called Hermes Trismegistus, which means the thrice great Hermes, who is this legendary Egyptian wise man and sage, a descendant of the god Hermes. Now, you can tell by reading the books they're actually written by many different people, and they all ascribe their writings to this one figure, which was a very common Egyptian practice, that when Egyptian scribes and priests and wise men wrote stuff, they wrote it and gave it the name of a god. So they're written by several different people, but they're all members of this same, depending the way you look at it, philosophical school or religious cult. So they all, it's in a similar way to the books of the New Testament. Were all written by different people, but about the same thing and expressing the same ideas. The Hermetic is a similar collection. No one knows specifically who wrote any of those books because they tended to keep themselves anonymous. But they were certainly around sort of about the same time, actually, that the New Testament books were being written. They disappeared from Europe for a long time because when Christianity took over as the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, these were books of pagan scholarship, so they were banned and rejected. They survived in the Middle East for a long time, and then at the time of the Renaissance, sort of in the middle of the 15th century, they were rediscovered. They were brought back to Europe, back to Florence, and it's really those books arriving in Florence is the thing that kicked off the Renaissance because of the ideas that were found in these books, not just sort of ideas about the way the world works and philosophy and things, but the whole image of mankind that was found in there was something that hugely inspired people like Leonardo, everyone through to sort of Shakespeare. They were just huge. The impact was huge.
Yeah, the thing about them that Guy at the Florence, of course, in Florence, his job was to translate lots of old classical Greek texts for the scholars and people to debate. And then when they got their hands on the Hermetica, and he had to drop everything. He had to drop everything because it was urgent. Everybody was so excited they had the Hermetica to translate. He had to concentrate, forget Plato. He had to concentrate on the Hermetica. And it was just such an exciting thing. And, now we don't really get a handle on it, but it was just the most exciting thing. Everybody was in a fever of excitement about it. And quite right, too, because the thing is, the Hermetica, one way or another, it directly inspired all the great names of the scientific revolution. Right. Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, the lot. They were directly inspired by it.
Now, I want to get to the core piece of this is that there's this separation that exists, and we see it all the time in our culture today between people that consider themselves rationalists, that are science-based in all of their thinking, which often proselytize a kind of atheism. They're almost evangelical atheists that go out to engage in the public forum and conversations, and they talk about science and how important, all we need is science, and anything outside of scientific belief is just myth or just, fairy tales. And they eschew any type of magical thinking or any kind of paranormal or any type of anything outside of that core scientific belief. And yet, if it hadn't been for magic, we wouldn't have modern science. Would that be fair to say?
Absolutely. And that's the thing that inspired us to write the book was listening to this debate between the rationalists and the religionists that's been going on for the last few years. We realised that the way that the origins and emergence of science is presented is distorted. That story is absolutely distorted because it's always presented as if it's what they call the scientific revolution that begins with Copernicus and it basically ends with Newton. So you've got a period of about 150 years that laid the foundations for modern science. And that's presented as if it's a sudden kind of outbreak of rationalism and logic. And it wasn't at all. It was directly inspired. We knew from the research we'd done over the years that it was directly inspired. So the Hermetica, which is basically a magical philosophy, directly inspired all these great names of the scientific revolution, from Copernicus to Newton, and including those figures and everyone in between. And that whenever the history of science is talked about, that side of it is completely ignored. And it's, as you say, if these books hadn't existed, we wouldn't have had science. We wouldn't have had the scientific revolution. So partly the reason we decided to write this book was, first of all, to redress that, to point out that there is this distortion in the way that the history of science is taught. It's taught with hindsight, like everything is. So that modern scientists looking back think that Copernicus and Newton were just like them, but they weren't. They were, totally into this magical idea, but yes, inspired them to do what we now call, scientific research and scientific experimentation, and that did lead to a big change in the way people studied the world and the universe.
All right, we'll leave it there. We'll hang on to that, Clive. We're going to get right back to that. Inspired by magic. And we'll talk about that direct connection with magic and how magical thinking created science and how it was really all about the pursuit of the mind of God. Coming up next on Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett. It was magic. It was magical thinking from this ancient collection of works known as the Hermetica. And that's the subject of the book, The Forbidden Universe. These were forbidden ideas. These were concepts that were suppressed by the church because they were all about alchemy. They were all about these forbidden sciences, which were really all about magic. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't have modern science. And yet, modern science is really, in a way, still a pursuit of magical thinking. We'll get back to that coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. All right, so we're talking about the origins of modern science. The Forbidden Universe is the new book by Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince. Is this connection any better? Hello?
Yes, it's a bit. Sometimes you do fade away a bit, but we'll keep going.
It's probably just my spirit. So the you know what I find so interesting about this, and we're talking about this book, the Hermetica, this collection of books that is like an encyclopedia of ancient pagan thought, which, while attributed to Hermes, was really a collection of a lot of different people writing under this the same philosophical outlook, and how influential it was in the creation of the Renaissance and the break from the what we call the Dark Ages. Is that this kind of thinking was so dangerous that we know it was at least partially responsible for the suppression of the thoughts of Galileo and of Copernicus, and part of the problem that many other people had as they followed in this belief system. And we would easily identify what these early scientists are doing as being having a kind of theology. They were not anti-God. They were not anti-religion. They were just pushing it in a different direction. And it's interesting that they are considered kind of the forefathers of modern atheists when they wouldn't have considered themselves atheists.
Oh, no, they were totally, I mean, they were in a sense in love with God, because they were, the whole point was that the Hermetica promoted an entirely different view of humanity from certainly the Catholic Church, which, the churches, shall we say, entirely different. I mean, the opposite. The church basically has it that we're born in sin, original sin, and we crawl around like worms on the earth, until the day we die, and even then we might be going to hell. And it's all negative. It's all very creepy and negative. But to the Hermeticists, to the people who followed the thoughts in the Hermetica, including all the big-name scientists of the scientific revolution, it was entirely different. It was all about man becoming godlike, that we have within us, as it were, the inner sun, the idea that we are partly God, and that all human beings are partly God, and we can get more like God by expanding our godlike qualities, which include what we would call scientific research, which include anything we want to put our minds on. Basically, anything is possible for a Hermeticist, completely different to what the church was teaching. And in those days, of course, the church was everything. The church was in charge,
right,
politically and every other way.
And that's why. So, at what point, I mean, would we have considered these people to be Kabbalists and alchemists, and they were interested in all these sort of secret, what they thought of as secret sciences, including that one? Who was it that was trying to turn souls into gold? Do I remember that correctly from the book?
Hermeticism is also a thing that is behind the philosophy is behind alchemy. If you like, it's applying the Hermetic principles in what we would now call the chemical area. You could apply these principles in many different ways, many different areas, and that's what made it, what made it so fruitful when people in different areas of research, whether they're looking at the solar system, or whether they're looking at medical research, or whether they're looking at chemistry, applying these principles worked. It led them to come up with discoveries. So in part, it's, I think it's often kind of grudgingly acknowledged by historians of science that, the early scientists, they did have some fairly, flaky ideas, like, that they hadn't grown up completely. Copernicus still believed in astrology, and Isaac Newton still believed in alchemy, and they're kind of humoured for that. as if that's, obviously in the early days of science, they couldn't really be expected to know any better. But when you actually look into it, you can't separate those two things. So it's another point we keep making in the book, is that people like Isaac Newton didn't make their discoveries despite having these kind of esoteric, magical beliefs. They made their discoveries because they had that they had those beliefs. That's what gave them the key. It's what gave Newton, for example, the key to understanding gravity. He took Hermetic principles, magical principles, and applied them to, the physical properties of matter and things like that. And that's what allowed him to crack the mystery of gravity that other people hadn't been able to do. And that specialists in Isaac Newton readily acknowledge that. It's surprising when you read those specialists, academic specialists are quite happy acknowledging that's where Newton got his ideas from. But when that is then portrayed to the public by historians of science and science programs, they completely ignore it and go back to this idea that, yes, he was he had some eccentric ideas despite being a great scientist. But it's absolutely at the core. Every major figure in the scientific revolution was not just inspired generally by magic, but by the very same text again and again. It's always the Hermetic text.
Yeah,
Right.
It gave them, as it were, permission to be daring in their thoughts.
Now, I do my portion of the show here kind of in the dark, just by the light of my my laptop screen, so I can't see. But it seems to me wasn't there a part in there about a guy that was trying to turn souls into gold? Am I just remembering that wrong from earlier this week on the porch when I was reading that? I thought that was fascinating, but it brings me back to a question I had though about Dan Brown, because you talk about Dan Brown in the book here, The Forbidden Universe. You talk about the Illuminati, and in the book Angels and Demons, which has gotten pretty well eviscerated for its for some of the liberties that he takes with history on this, but you make a case that really we shouldn't be thinking about the Illuminati. We should be thinking about another group which has been largely lost to history. Can either of you explain that?
Yes, because like everybody else, when we read Angels and Demons, we were quite sort of critical on some of the historical side, particularly to do with the Illuminati, the secret society that Dan Brown talks about in the book and that's in the movie. But the strange thing was that when we actually went back to look at some of these things, we were actually doing there was a documentary that went with the Angels and Demons movie that we took part in, and when we revisited some of this the history there, we actually kind of realised that there actually was a secret society around that involved the same people that Dan Brown talks about, the sculptor Bernini and Galileo and people like that, but it wasn't the Illuminati. There was a secret society that was formed by a man named Giordano Bruno, who's like a huge figure in the 16th century, almost completely forgotten today, but one of the giants of that period. He should be remembered in the same way that Galileo and Newton are, but for reasons that we'll come on to, history is kind of embarrassed by him, because Bruno, he was burnt at the stake in Rome in 1600, was a real kind of intellectual giant of the time, absolutely inspired by the Hermetica, but not just inspired in terms of science. He came up with ideas that were way, way ahead of his time, again, by applying these Hermetic principles, ideas of an infinite universe and other inhabited planets. But he was also a great sort of religious and political reformer. He wanted to transform the whole of society based on the Hermetic principles, which is what got him into trouble. Now, he founded a secret society. We're talking here about 1580s, 1590s. He travelled around the intellectual centres of Europe, and he set up this network of a secret society that is only really known by the name the Giordanisti, named after from his name Giordano Bruno. And this secret society later, this did have an influence on Galileo. I don't know whether Galileo was a part of it, but he was certainly in contact with members of it. And it also did later involve people like Bernini. So suddenly we actually found that the core historical part of angels and demons does actually work if you cross out Illuminati and you put Giordanisti in instead. Which kind of, it surprised us when we started to put this together and realised there is, I don't know where Dan Brown got these ideas from, but there is actually, they do work. And in some ways it was, they have similar characteristics of the Illuminati in Angels and Demons, in that they're kind of pro-scientific research. They're anti the church in a sense, because the church is out to get them. They're basically Bruno's idea, which sounds crazy now, but at the time could have worked, was to actually kind of not overthrow the church, but to actually transform the church into a Hermetic religion. And he did actually manage to interest quite a lot of kings and emperors, and even certain popes were interested in this idea that that the Hermetica actually, you could actually incorporate Christianity into the Hermetic thinking. Now, it was obviously made him dangerous to people like the Inquisition and the Jesuits, which is why he ended up being burned at the stake.
Burned at the stake, yeah.
Because of that challenge that he posed. But it does appear, the basic scenario in Angels and Demons does work.
Yeah, and the other thing that Bruno wanted to do, which just shows what a threat he was, what a huge threat he was to the church, was, as Clive said, he wanted to reform the Church of Rome from within and make it, let's be honest, more like the ancient Egyptian religion, the Hermetic philosophy. That's what it's really about. That was the religious side. But politically, what he wanted to do was to unite a war-torn Europe. I mean, at the time, Europe was, in shreds because of religious wars, essentially, between the Catholics and the new Protestants. And what he wanted to do was get the Protestant nations united under one leader, and he thought Elizabeth I of England would do, and the Catholics united under another leader, which he thought the King of France, Henri, would do, and then they would talk peace, and there would be peace and harmony, and within that, then he could have his religious Hermetic revolution. So you can imagine what an enormous threat he was. And considering that, it is amazing that nobody's heard of him, or very few people have heard of him now.
Bruno being this really kind of lost to history figure, and there's a statue for him in Europe. I mean, there's still, and it's not like it's not like there's no proof he exists or that he's an apocryphal figure. We know that he's real. And you make the argument, though, that it sounds similar to what the Illuminati was about, the Illuminati being an organization that was started as an attempt to infiltrate the much more powerful, larger Freemasons and to change the Freemasons into the same type of organization that you were talking about, Hermeticists invading the Catholic Church and changing the Catholic Church into the organization it wanted to be. They were following the same playbook. Essentially, yes.
It basically it is the same agenda that is in the fictional version in Angels and Demons, but it is basically the same agenda.
Yeah. Now, I did find the part where I was talking about. I know you all thought I was crazy. So we're talking about Rosenkreutz, the followers of Rosenkreutz.
Rosicrucians, yeah.
Yeah, the Rosicrucians. Now, the Brotherhood declared itself to be Christian, but of a reformed kind of Christian. I'm reading from the book The Forbidden Universe, and to follow an alchemical philosophy whose focus was on transmuting base souls into divine gold. That was the part that hooked me. I wasn't quite sure what you meant by that. So what's that about?
Well,
the Rosicrucians.
It's not a chemical thing. It's not a physical thing. So it would be a nice thought, wouldn't it, that you could get a lump of gold from, change your soul into a lump of gold and sell it. That would be good. That's probably what they mean by selling souls. But we didn't mean that. I mean, the true alchemy was about transforming one's spirit, one's soul, one's mind. And the idea is, you start off with a sort of uninformed, uneducated, unenlightened, and through a process of alchemy, you become enlightened. Your whole self becomes, as it were, divine gold.
Okay.
It's a key message of the Hermetic books is that it's basically this message to humanity, to human beings, saying, most of the time we're very negative about human beings. We think of ourselves as being greedy and corrupt, and we spend a lot of time following our sort of more basic passions to sort of acquire things, and the Hermetic thing is saying, no, you're worth more than this. There's a whole spiritual world there, there's a whole intellectual world, and it's kind of this wake up call to say, basically stop wallowing in the mud and try and climb up to the stars. And this idea was taken up by the Rosicrucians, who expressed it in that way. It's like, the analogy of classical alchemy is taking a lump of worthless material and through various processes turning it into something valuable and glittering. And that's saying you can do that with your soul. You can do that with yourself. You can pull yourself up out of the mud. Which again is that big contrast with what had always been taught in Europe, that basically, we're all stuck in the mud, and the only thing that can get us out of it is going to church every day, and then maybe at the end of it we'll get somewhere. And it was this whole thing of saying, you're responsible for your own destiny. You can climb up by your own efforts. The Rosicrucians, I have to say, were incredibly influential on sort of Western esoteric thinking that emerged at the beginning of the 17th century, about 10, 20 years after Giordano Bruno was killed. There's very strong evidence that the Rosicrucians were essentially, the people behind the Rosicrucians were the Giordanisti, because they emerged from exactly the same circles that Bruno had been in. And there's very close tie-ups with Bruno's followers in Italy and the Rosicrucian, which really started in Germany. So there's a reason why this same message comes out of the Rosicrucian material. It's coming from the same place. It's coming from the Hermetic tradition.
Well, I want to try something a little bit different coming up next hour. Let me take your temperature though and see whether you're good with this. I'd like you to, from the perspective that you have now, of going back and tracing the origins of science back to the occult. Let's leap forward, and if you could, where do you see these traces of the occult, these traces of the work of Bruno, or the traces of the work of these other early alchemists and magicians? Where do you see that work still evident? And when in modern science, does it end at some point, or do we continue to inherit this kind of magical thinking from these early pioneers of science? Because that's what the Forbidden Universe is about. Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, The Occult Origins of Science and the Search for the Mind of God. That the early scientists were all occultists. Well, what about the modern scientists? Where do they still show evidence of those roots? We'll get to that coming up next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett.